and the sense of proportion understanding, I don't think it means any drastic change in developments in the East. I think the trend, which I'll say a few words on later, will continue. Such things happen, imagine you wouldn't have any long to go final peace in the East. But there is no ground, I would say, for any particular apprehension. I just want to make sure this is more. You hear me now, all clearly? Right. Now, first of all, you'll be welcomed by the notables of Israel, those who have already spoken to you, and those who will be speaking to you. And I know that the people of Israel, the rank and file, the common people, those who bear the burden day in, day out, those who participate in the sense of redemption and investment in the Jewish people. They feel your visit here at this period, particularly in connection with the opening of the person celebration. It's an index not only of your support and sympathy for Israel, but even deeper of this panorama, I would call it, of identification of a new unity which embraces Jews across the world. This, I would say, is one of 4 dialogues which have unfolded and will continue to unfold in the wake of the phenomenal event of the 6-Day War. But first, let us try to study in background where we stood here before then in the deeper sense, and what ripples, what results, what consequences are on the march of the world scene within the Middle East and maybe within the Jewish soul. About a month before the war, I was on a visit to the United States in Washington and New York. I was privileged in New York to be invited by a very large publishing house for a discussion on the nature of history. They were proposing to study the possibility of bringing out some great works on what they called the decisive events of human history. And there were professors and research historians and men, statesmen, men of understanding of world affairs. We were trying to discuss the criteria of a great event in history, and naturally reached the conclusion that it must be an event without which, against the broad panorama of history, mankind would be different. In other words, the evolution of human consciousness, the sense of understanding, the grasp of a universal panorama of human experience would have been different without this specific event. We went across this span of history, ancient times, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Egyptians, right down to the Middle Ages, the great revolutions of history, American Revolution, the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, various ideologies, the great personalities, discussing whether personality is in itself an event in history, or whether history would have been the same without the personality. And suddenly they turned to me and said, now, we've invited you here, not with any background or tracking, not as an Israel delegate, not even as a student of Judaism, but tell us, should we embark on such a project, what would you consider were the great events of Jewish history which should be fixed in the context of great events affecting the entire gamut of human experience? I submitted to them 4, and I said these 4, however one approaches them on an ideological basis, must be accepted as central to human experience as we know it, having unfolded across the ages. The first I submitted was the Exodus from Egypt, sense of a higher power liberating slaves into freedom. Human history would have been different without that record of memory and that sense that there is a transition of purpose and human evolution from slavery to a higher power, to liberty. Jew or non-Jew, from east to west, every movement of liberty, every onward impulse to freedom has been affected by that memory. And the strands of his experience cut across continents and experiences and movements which seem totally divorced from this essence and core, but in fact flow from that source. That they accepted. And by the way, none of those are pure faith. Secondly, I said the scientific dispensation, the Ten Commandments, and the Torah, however you approach that revolution of the human spirit, the dialogue with a higher power which took place in Sinai, however you analyze it, mankind would not be the same without it. The streams of its impact stretch across human consciousness right down the ages, also accepted. Thirdly, I said the phenomenon of prophecy, of foreseeing events, thousands of years hence, of the panorama of human experience, of human destiny in a constructive sense, in its onward movement, interlocked with the specific Jewish destiny as it links with the universal destiny of peace and freedom. Also accepted. And finally, I submitted the destruction of the temple and the exiles of the Jews close to 2,000 years ago. And here they halted and said, why would you include that as a major event of human experience? I said, why? Because the destruction of the temple meant the loss of the spiritual anchor of the Jew. And his exile across the world meant the first time that a human experienced the concept of lowliness of an individual as a nation, the sense of a lack of spiritual wholesomeness, the desire to return to a cradle, to a land, to a source, to be reunited with a great inspiration that in itself symbolizes a whole gamut of human thoughts and feeling down the ages. It's found musician and definition in the destruction of the temple and the withdrawal of the Jew from the land of his father. Moreover, with the Jewish exile, the entry of the Jew into the light lanes of world civilization commenced, with all that flows from it. On this, they reserved judgment. But then they said to me, now we objected. True, you represent Israel, but here we're scholars talking frankly and objectively and off the record. Is the state of Israel an event in world history? I said frankly, as yet not. It is a phenomenon in world history that a nation, a people, snapped asunder from a land for close to 2,000 years, in its vast majority never seeing the land, maintaining its vitality and unity rooted in prophetic faith, returning to this land with a phenomenal unity, uniting Jews from Western Europe and from the cave societies of North Africa and from the remote hinterland of India, all together in a decisive unity, in a new strata of nationhood, which itself is ancient and always renewing. That in itself, and feeling at home in a land which has been desolate for close to 2,000 years, a land which has never accepted or adopted any other people, nor historically become identified with any entity, national or tribal. That is a phenomenon of history. It is not yet a great and decisive event of human history. This debate, as I said, took place a month before the war. If I are asked the same question, and I probably will meet them again in New York in a few weeks' time, I would say today the prospects of Israel becoming an event of decisive significance in world history, that prospect has been drawn much closer by the Six-Day War, and even more by the endless ripples across the world scene which flow from it. For wherever you turn, the impact of this rapid victory, this fantastic transition from ultimate peril, or what seems to be that, to endless triumph, the endless calculations across the world's capitals, all these are still issues which are unfolding, the ultimate consequences and definitions of which still define the human eye and certainly the capacity for immediate analysis. For wherever you turn, you feel this impact within the Soviet bloc as it surveys its world penetration and courses of influence. Moscow is in constant meditation, has its program in the Middle East, which costed some $3 billion over 10 years. Has it failed, or is it still in chance of success? Should it move to confrontation, or should it continue to counsel caution? Has its foreign aid program been well-based? Has its concept of Islam and the Arab world been founded in a reality, or is it purely a mirage of political illusion? Where does Moscow go in the Middle East? And as it goes, what are its contacts with the Western world? Is there a ground for a contact, for a search, for a new world power approach to the Middle East? Or does the situation in Vietnam and other parts of the world block it? All these questions surely lie foremost in the thoughts of the analysts and political leaders in the Kremlin. As you move further away, Peking turns on Moscow violently and says you've abandoned the friend of communism in the Middle East. This has become a basic issue within the entire complex of communist power, ranging from China right across Eastern Europe. Within Eastern Europe, Romania has split apart from the Moscow line. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, the problem as to whether the communitarian approach on Middle East was correct is hotly debated. According to newspaper reports, leaders of the Polish army have called for Soviet experts to study whether the arms they have under the Warsaw Pact are of sufficient validity in view of the collapse of Egyptian forces. All these matters, they stimulate and ferment across a vast bloc which is neighbor of the Middle East and whose courses and policies have prejudiced the possibility of peace over the past 10 years. As you move further apart, as you go across to your great country, the United States, there are theses and thoughts and analyses and programs and concepts in the Middle East built up over 10 and even 20 and possibly 30 years. Millions of reams of papers written by counselors and advisors and foreign policy institutes all go into the air as their concepts of personality for the balance of power and the future of the Middle East and the mainstream of power in the Middle East have been shattered by a reality they could not conceive. If you go to London, which is edged apart today from the focal point of world power, whose influence in the Middle East is diminished to a very low point, again British policy in the Middle East must necessarily be reappraised. In Paris, the prophecies of what would happen have vanished, with possible consequences for the validity of those who proclaim them. In Ottawa, and every other capital where political analysts have followed this problem across the years, there's a vacuum of thought, and officials for many weeks and months hesitated to present their ministers with briefs and data and proposals, for in this vacuum they sought to regain their balance. The United Nations, which in 1956, against the background of the previous Suez conflict, moved onto the world scene as a major instrument for peacekeeping. That role was shattered by the miscalculation on May the 19th of this year affecting the United Nations force in Sinai. And today the United Nations must, as a collective body, realize that the frustration, the lack of action which it suffered and which it is guilty over 20 years on the Arab-Israel conflict. So every capital you move, you feel the permanent thought of search. Moreover, there is a desire to probe new courses and new dialogues open across the world. Within the Arab world, before June the 5th, there were three camps. There was the moderate camp of Morocco and Tunis, maybe Jordan and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia possibly in the background, which in their heart and hearts felt that war could not solve the problem and sought a political solution. For they had neither the capacity nor the expression nor the status, nor maybe the possibility of overcoming long-standing emotions to emerge into clear political thought. On the other side, there was Syria and Algeria, which pressed for immediate war, particularly Syria. In between stood President Nasser, who tilted to the side of Syria and Algeria in terms of looking at the war as a solution of the problem, but counseled paradoxically enough to wait to wait until the Arab world is united, is powerful enough, and by the very dynamism of his presence will be able to create a condition in which what he assumed to be an alien body of the Middle East would of itself fall apart. At the background of the Six-Day War, there lay a phenomenal meeting of three circumstances. There was this same Syria which pressed for war and decided against the decision of the Arab Summit conferences to force war on the Arab world by sending in al-Qaeda murder gangs into Israel week in, week out, to which we had to react. But that alone was not a call for war. There was the added consideration of the Soviet Union, for the first time, had found a government in Damascus, which in its ideological view was close to Moscow, very, very close. And the Soviet Union decided that come what may, they would not allow that regime to fall. So, in the year preceding the war, a remarkable dialogue took place between Israel and the Soviet Union. The Soviets said to us, do not strike Syria. If you strike Syria, you are serving world oil interests, you are serving intelligence organizations, you are still to the Western world, and that we cannot tolerate. And we said to them, we are neither sued nor seek to be sued. But we cannot live here if our farmers are killed day in, day out in the northern villages. We no part of Israel can survive either spiritually or unity or indeed physically if our people are cut down no matter how remote the area near the frontier in the north. And we said, talk to Damascus and influence Damascus to halt this penetration, and we naturally will not act. The answer of Moscow was they're doing their best, and our best assessment is they tried to influence the Syrians. And the Syrians, like tradition and history, are beyond any influence, certainly externally, and possibly themselves. But there was a third factor in this meeting of circumstances. The third factor was the fact that in Cairo, the president, when he came to power in 1952, he raised a great dream and vision across the Arab world of an Arab unity, with a further circle of Islamic unity, and ultimately African unity, circle within circle. And he set out on this process from 53, stage by stage. By 1958, he reached a turning point when he unified Egypt with Syria, and the United Arab Republic came to be. At that moment, he thought his dream was about to be realized. But within 4 years, the xenophobic, endemically unstable Syrians revolted also against the Egyptian army. And in 1962, the union of Egypt and Syria was snapped apart. Nasser never gave up the name of the United Arab Republic. He continued in this concept, which was an illusion, but kept onto it, because without it, he had lost the anchor of ideology. And as the dark months of the last year proceeded, as clash after clash developed in Syria, Nasser's traumatic impact of 62 stirred again within it. And as Syria said to him, if Arab unity means anything, why do you sit silent in Cairo while we are challenged by Israel forces? Nasser, again the old dream arose in his mind, and he decided he could not allow the Damascus regime to be overthrown, although this was never our purpose. Our purpose was to defend the lives of our citizens. But his assumption and the assumption in Moscow in early April was that if Syria continued, the apparently would continue the provocation, and Israel naturally would strike back. A position might be created where the regime in Damascus would collapse. And so in the early days of May, these three factors met together to cause this vast explosion of the Six-Day War, the results of which are beginning, as I said, to unfold. Where do we stand today? What do we hope will emerge? We feel that the balance in the Arab world, I spoke earlier of three camps before June the 5th. These three camps still exist. But I believe the balance of the moderate element, of the more realistic element, is growing, although gradually. You have a situation where an element of realism is penetrating the Arab mind, where they're beginning to ask themselves whether further provocation, further attack will not bring further disaster, whether this continuing chapter of resistance, of violence, of obstruction, of boycott, of blockade has done to the final analysis added yet one more chapter to Israel's stability and capacity to survive. This process may take a long time. It may be overturned because nobody knows the imponderability involved. In order for this process to move ahead, the three things are essential. The first is that Israel's military deterrent capacity be maintained at the highest possible level. In other words, any dream of any Arab colonel or leader across the Middle East from Algeria to Damascus, a renewal of war in more favorable circumstances than June may, God forbid, cause a reversal of Israel's present position. Such idea must be rejected by the reality force of Israel's deterrent capacity. Secondly, it is crucial that the great powers keep their hands off the Middle East. They have done so till now. Although over 10 years the involvement of the Cold War in the area prejudiced any chance of Arab-Israel peace. But today, as Washington and Moscow and others stand apart to a degree, and in fact tell the parties to consider the situation within a regional process, although Russian policy is entirely different from American policy, but there is a slight common line at this stage in this respect. If this continues, the Arabs must come to a point where they will look straight and honest into the looking glass, see their failings and failure over 20 years, and begin to move in the direction of realism. I personally think the trend in the Middle East is towards peace. There may be trouble, there may be other chains of reactions and counter-reactions, but I believe the basic stratum of the situation is a positive one, although its ultimate outcome may yet hang in balance. And thirdly, it is crucial that both the United Nations and in the great capitals of the world, the statesmen should cease playing around with formulas, which although externally impressive, inherently are empty. There can be no solution to the Middle East until Arab and Jew face each other at the negotiating table, until this miasma, complex and fear, under 20 years entrenchment in psychological frustration, until it is swept away by that direct communication which can only come from direct contact. No holding of belligerency, no empty formulas, no banner recognition. All this means nothing. Or within a week or a month or a year or 5 years, as long as the veil of remoteness of hostility remains, these formulas can never reach that reality of communication, which is the only guarantee for peace. It is a slow process. It has not been easy for the Arabs to grasp the nature of Israel's residence, citizenship, and permanence in this country. I spoke earlier of the phenomenon of the people returning to land after close to 2,000 years. This phenomenon is beyond the canon of 20th century thought. It touches roots of faith and continuity without parallel human analysis. The great thinkers of the world, the statesmen, grasp it to a degree. It is not so easy and has not been easy for our neighbors to fully comprehend it. But I believe that after 3 wars, the consciousness is slowly emerging in their minds that this cannot be some flotsam and jetsam of from an alien body uprooted by Nazi persecution from Europe, brought here as their propagandas taught them by Wall Street and Jewish machinations across the world. They must begin to realize there is essential truth here. There's something inherent, binding, decisive, permanent in this vast adventure of the Spirit, which, as I said, has no parallel across the span of history. As this consciousness permeates, and it will permeate, provided external factors don't disrupt it, provided no illusion of furthermore rise in their minds in face of Israel's military power, providing United Nations and great capitals do not go along with them in face-saving formulas of no value, of total banality, and providing the hands-off policy of the great powers in any direct involved in the Middle East is sustained, then this flicker of consciousness must grow to a flame. And at that moment the barriers will collapse. And as they collapse and a true dialogue develops, then maybe indeed the state of Israel's existence as a core of the Middle East, of a vast new area of progress and understanding and Islamic Jewish dialogue, maybe indeed it will have proved to be one of the great and decisive events of history. For Islam and Judaism met many times across the gamut of history and can meet again. There is no basic hostility there in a spiritual sense. It is a political conflict and not a spiritual one. It is a misunderstanding of the nature of Israel and the nature of Islam. These are the issues at stake, and they may move on. I have spoken to you, ladies and gentlemen, in outline of the dialogues as they unfold across the world in this phenomenal transition, providential in its essence, of Israel from mortal peril to the actual achievement, of the dialogue with the statesmen of the Western world, who 20 years have conquered the Middle East without coming decisive to cut at the roots of direct communication and establish that as the basic and only thesis of the Middle East. They have not told the Arabs straight, you cannot keep the Middle East beyond the context of world affairs. That there be charter of the United Nations on negotiations of peace against boycott and blockade, and warlike atmosphere and violence and threat all over the world. But there be some remote island called the Middle East, which is not so remote that it disrupts the world. That your statesmen can preach peace in every form. When it comes to the Middle East, it can turn aside and say it is not relevant. This is a new dialogue in the Western capitals. And within this dialogue, concepts of power here have vanished or been heavily defeated. The natural threat and out of all over the years has proved to be battle and futile. We now know over the past months the world has been proved clearly that the Arabs need the West to buy the oil. More than the West needs the Arabs to sell the oil. Another voting with the Suez Canal. And that too has proved to be much more secondary importance than ever assumed. And so with these major, I would say, prejudices arising from misunderstanding as they are dissipated to some degree, but not entirely, this dialogue with the Western world can unfold. And I've spoken of the dialogue, this intuitive and visible contact with the Arab world, beyond the artillery duels and the airfights, beyond those miasma of terror and hostility, of this flicker of light which I sincerely believe is developing at a certain point, provided it is not quenched before its time's fulfillment. But there's a third dialogue, and that too is probably the most exotic, a dialogue of Rome and Jerusalem, which has developed after the Six-Day War. The Jews back in Jerusalem, under Israel's sovereignty, for the first time close to 2,000 years. In this respect, the wheel of history is turned. I was in Rome some months ago, and afterwards negotiated with the patriarchs of the old city and the state of Jerusalem. And one day, one of the leading prelates, he took a document, and he said to me, I'm the 96th patriarch of Jerusalem. My first predecessor was appointed in the holy city by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And therefore, if you want to negotiate on the holy places in Jerusalem, I am the person you must first talk to. As you develop this thought in pieces and status down the ages, I must admit that diplomatically I was somewhat amiss, because my mind traveled over the contemporary scene, from his palace and all his majesty and his priestly acolytes round him, and as he talked and talked of his record down the ages, my mind too flashed back to 451, some 1,550 years ago. At that time, it was 200 years, I reminded myself, from the closing of the Mishnah, the basis of the oral law. It was 50 years after the redaction of what we call the Jerusalem Talmud, which was compiled in the land of Israel. It was just at the time when the entire sector of spiritual authority of the Jewish people had moved to Babylon, and the Babylonian Talmud was too reaching its consummation. At that time, Jerusalem was only a capital area for 300 years. No Jew could physically tread in the sacred soil of the sacred city with which his eternity, past, present, and future, in endless continuity is linked. At that time, the remnants of the communities of Palestine were on the verge of extinction. Within 90 years, they were to rise in an ultimate revolt against Persia and to be dispersed across the world. And within 2 centuries, Islam under Omar was to conquer Jerusalem. But in 451, the Council of Chalcedon appointed the first Christian patriarch of Jerusalem. And with that, to any observer of those days who knew the power of Rome, temporal and spiritual, 100 years after Constantine, the Christian emperor, being in power, at that time, in face of such vast power, with Persia weak and Egypt with Rome, with Greek philosophy having given its final word, this seemed to be the ultimate in human experience and vision and spiritual impulse. And at that moment, Jerusalem, not only physically, but spiritually, seemed to be snatched from Jewish hands for all time. And as the patriarch continued to speak, I thought, suppose a Jew in a synagogue in 451, in Rome, in Crete, in Cyprus, in Alexandria, in the dispersed community of Jewry, and said on that day, a patriarch has been appointed in Jerusalem, but 1,550 years hence. Prophecy will be fulfilled. A Jewish official will come to the old city of Jerusalem, and the 96th descendant of this first patriarch will say to him, Jerusalem, I agree with yours, but assure me and assure my church and Christendom the rights we know you promised to assure. And the assurance was given without difficulty, or with us as a central aspect of our foreign policy, to reach agreement on the religious status and the universal interest in the holy city of Jerusalem. And as I thought of this remarkable, phenomenal swing of history, as if the wheel of history turned round, and my mind moved back to the bottom of the great events of history, and I thought we are on the verge of the phenomenon turning into the great event. But in order to bring it about totally, we come to the final dialogue. And the final dialogue is within the soul of the Jewish people. For before the 6-day war, grave questions were raised of new ideologies of Israel and diaspora, and Israel declining in influence, and Jerusalem having lost its impact to some degree on the Jewish soul across the world. And then came those terrible weeks of isolation, and Israel stood in mortal peril. And every Jew across the world, even those remote, as remote one can be from their faith and their people and its association, they suddenly felt an isolation which touched them to their depths, and they suddenly understood the ancient Midrash, why the word Abraham Hayvi, what does Abraham the Hebrew mean, that Israel is on one side of the world and all the rest of the world on the other. At that moment, a new unity was formed. And we refuse to believe that as this new epoch unfolds, that unity will not find ever-deepening expression. In find you're coming here not only on the philanthropic basis, but on the stimulus for that basis, on the sense of spiritual identification. It will find that we will believe it, and this is crucial to our existence and future, as the whole week of tens of thousands of youth to study here. It's the vast panorama of a new dialogue, not in speech that has gone along in banal and frustrated form for years, and only in form of self-speech, which is self-frustration, but in a continuing and unfolding action, as you are not partners, because partners means two sides to an enterprise, but one and the same with us as the great event of the Jewish state and its new dispensation unfolds into the future.
A long time to be back on the culture to the United States. However, I can do my best. I shall do my best in brief to try to sum up for you before you leave our inner thoughts on Israel's processes and progress, and how she marches with what measure of rational analysis into the great abnormal future. I'm sure that you here, having spent with us a week, have been touched by this new spirit, the Dinan Sultan of the world, which descends among all Jews from across the world as we reach the falls of Israel's leader. The leader is in one sense, yet expansive to the other, apparently temporary, yet so permanent, seemingly agnostic, but believing deeper than the other people. Now, how should I describe to you in brief the vast panorama of Israel's inner thought, the relations with the Middle East, the relations on a global scale, the great spiritual confrontations she has to meet, and how she plans this in the future. I would say firstly, this problem, as you, this group, can more better understand than other groups we discuss, is not only a problem of the balance of world power in the region, not only a problem of the future of the area as such, not only a meeting of the Arab capitals, the Arab world and Israel, which extends far beyond to vast frameworks which cover Beijing, Moscow, Belgrade, Moscow, Warsaw, Moscow, Washington, and the basic balance of forces of the world, British Empire, gives its last death gasp, the attempt of France to regain positions across North Africa, right across the Arab world. The whole future of the neutralist bloc has been heavily damaged by the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The whole balance I would say, of geopolitical forces, at some point or another, cannot escape the unfolding epoch in the Middle East. But again, even deeper, this issue has cosmic proportions. Tell you of them from the Jew is totally unnecessary, because the Jew who doesn't feel them is lacking in basic identification. Surely to an audience of this nature, one doesn't need to dwell on this point. But even in world spiritual play, we have this confrontation of Roman Jerusalem after close to 2,000 years. We have a confrontation with Islam. In both cases, the city in which we now are sitting, the city of Shekhinah, the city of eternal prophecy, the city of lasting inspiration for the Jewish people, is the focal point of conflict at present, maybe of unfolding dialogue into the future. My duties carry me across the world very often, and I face the dichotomy, moving from the chancelleries of the great, from the foreign offices where decisions are taken which can affect this country and the area, from meetings in Rome with the princes of the church, meetings with Arabs, this part of the world, and it always comes back to our own people. I would say even with a sense of dichotomy. Whereas one faces the outer world, as one engages in rim after rim of dialogue, you feel an awesome suspense, a great questioning as to what is the nature of this spiritual adventure which is Israel reborn. What lies behind this sudden leap forward in history from the gas ovens of Auschwitz only 25 years ago to becoming if not the major force in the Middle East today, a force which stretches from the vast artery of world commerce and power, the Suez Canal, right across the land of Israel, up to the Golan Heights. At each point, meeting vast forces in east and west, and within the Arab world, as it too seeks its course into the unknown. How can I describe to you this cosmic nature of the problem? I had a discussion in a great publishing house only some months ago with a publisher who was bringing out a book for non-Jews aged 15 to 18 on major perspectives of world history. He was a professor who was writing it in this publishing house, a book guaranteed to be sold across universities, the final classes of secondary schools, or what you call college in the United States. The idea being to give some essence, some common perspective, some broad viewpoint of the unfolding of human experience down the ages, so that from that point the students could go into a deeper study in history period by period. Now this man, a non-Jew, professor at Leeds University, he consulted me, and he said he's got trouble with his Jewish friends. He must put in the Jews somewhere in this volume. And they gave him various ideas of which he consulted me, and I counseled him to the best of my ability. And he agreed the Jewish contribution to civilization was significant indeed. The Jews deserved the mention. And he went over period after period what were the turning points of the Jewish experience. But he said, my problem is that my Jewish friends say you must introduce the destruction of the Jewish temple into a panorama of world history. And I, as a rational historian, can't agree with them. Because in those days, Lahavdil, this ayat, hundreds of thousands of sacred shrines of the ancient world were destroyed. The Mongolians are penetrating China for a new millennium of Chinese history. India, as we know it today, was a vast amalgam, a vast turning point of tribes seeking some identity. Across the world we call the Western and Eastern world of today, the Roman Empire was supreme. The legions battling the wars of empire, and what is England today, across to North Africa, right down to the Persian Gulf. And this is true, so he said, that it took more than 2 legions to quench the forces of Judea, the last revolt of Bar Kokhba, even earlier destruction of the temple. It is also true that in reporting, the commander of the legions did not salute the Roman Senate, the usual language, and all was well with our troops. But he said, in basic analysis, anybody who studies the rise and fall of the Roman Empire cannot accept any chauvinistic concept Jews might have, that the battle of the Jews against Rome really tore apart or began the process of the ripping apart of the Roman Empire as the greatest power the world knows. After all, the Jews were just one more tribe in this vast amalgam of subject peoples which Rome managed to control and break. Wherefore, then, has the destruction of the Jewish temple got any significance on a major scale in the conscience of mankind? I told them that extraneously is absolutely right, that indeed the rational historian could make such an argument. However, I told them of my talks in Rome with the Vatican, of this very exotic dialogue unfolding between Rome and Jerusalem after close to 2,000 years. I told them of what the cardinals told me, the princes of the church, and we can only talk to you on a diplomatic level. We can talk to you as a diplomatic representative of one more state, which holds Jerusalem at present. And we, with our worldwide far-flung interests, must assure our state and our access to our institutions. But we cannot discuss this issue with you theologically, the nature of the Jewish restoration to Jerusalem. This is not the subject of our talk. I asked them, why is this? And they said to do so would mean a very deep thrust indeed to the fabric of Christian thought over centuries. And this at present we are not prepared to do. And again, if you move further to speak to Arabs, you hear the echo of Islam, ranging from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf and down to Southeast Asia, to Pakistan, to Indonesia, where again you face probably the major part of the southern half of the globe, and close to 1 billion people. And again the issue comes back to Jerusalem. They tell you there can be no yielding of this city, for without it, Arab and Islamic humiliation is far too deep for us to survive with spiritual self-respect. And so this issue of the Jew in Jerusalem, the Jew with sovereignty in Jerusalem, the Jew restored after an exile, this phenomenal unity of land and people symbolized in its ultimate essence the Jewish presence in this city, in the city of cities in human history. This affects major centers of world thought today, whether the Catholic be agnostic or the Muslim remote from its religion. He does ultimately anchor back on this issue to the basic question, what is the meaning of the Jew in Jerusalem? Is this but a temporary phase, 17, 18 conquests in history, just one more? Or has it got a deeper meaning? And if it has a deeper meaning, where do Christianity and Islam, in their broad perspective of human experience, where do they stand in relation to it? And I told this professor of history that any modern man cannot understand, in my mind, the unfolding of basic spiritual processes which have, at a certain point, their relationship to the Jew in Jerusalem today, with all it means for the balance of world forces, and even deeper for the spiritual dialogue unfolding, without understanding the destruction of the Jewish temple over 2,000 years ago, or without the concept of exile, which sprang from that destruction, and which became a terminology accepted across the entire dictionary of human thought. The concept of Shkhinta B'Galuta, of behold, the divine presence itself is in exile with its people. Without that concept, there could be no return. There could be no supremacy of the spiritual over the material factor of human history, which the Israel reborn symbolizes. And Jerusalem would have been just one event in the story of the nation which has become petrified across the passage of history. And so the two link, and they link in one essence. the essence being the issue of continuity. The professor accepted the thesis that the destruction of the Second Temple against the canvas of the War of 1967 and what may develop around this city could not be ignored in any summary of world events across the ages. What I was trying to say to him was that the basic problem, the basic issue within the Jewish soul and in the dialogue with the various frameworks with whom we speak is ultimately this issue of continuity. Here lies everything compressed, digested, summarized, and uplifted. What are these ribs of dialogue? There is the dialogue with the Western world, with our friends, the United States and Canada, United Kingdom, across Latin America, Benelux, Scandinavia. They have more or less accepted that there can be no return to the situation of 1967. There's no point in pressing Israel to withdraw to a further abyss of uncertainty and insecurity, such as hung over day in, day out for close to 20 years. However, let us be frank, we have differences of opinion. The differences relate, and I'm not talking of anything final, for all this is in the gestated period. It hasn't come to the test, but one can feel on one's fingertips is what will constitute secure boundaries to which we are requested to withdraw. There are differences as to what is the validity of international guarantees. There are differences of assessments over the past year and a half as to the flow of events. The ultimate difference is in the immediate sense in whose favor is time working. For across the Western world, they have their doubts as to whether time is working in favor of Israel and indeed of the Western world. I recall last year in January 1968, the Prime Minister visited the President of the United States in Texas. We have here the ex-minister from Washington with us, now Ambassador to Canada, Ambassador Everall, he's present with us. The central core of the debate was, in whose favor is time working? The President put his case as we went across to Canada to speak to Prime Minister Pearson. He had his background from his Canadian ambassador in Washington, and he too opened the talk by saying, Mr. Prime Minister, surely time is not in your favor. And from there we flew to London. We were received by Mr. George Brown, former Prime Minister, Secretary of State, Foreign Affairs. In a vast room with all the portraits of Britain's heyday of greatness, the great Foreign Secretary, we sat down at a table facing the Foreign Secretary. And then he suddenly, for peculiar reasons, surrounded by his permanent officials, he suddenly had a slip in the diplomatic sense, an aside, a soliloquy. And as he opened with a regular question, Mr. Prime Minister, we are worried. In whose favor is time working? He suddenly halted, and he spoke to himself, and he said, what did I say? I said Israel and time. But after all, Israel is timeless. But he shook himself back into sobriety very rapidly. And he immediately said, let me put our case why time is not working in your favor. I would say that the central debate of the Western world, although it can be very severe and may become severer still, and let us acknowledge facts, we may in the coming months or the coming years, we may have to stand isolated against a hostile world not only of our enemies, but even of our friends. This may involve a vast, maybe the greatest test of Jewish endurance, of Jewish faith versus Arab faithlessness, but also of Jewish capacity to prove the ancient Midrash, Avraham Ha'ivri, Avraham Ha'ivri Mizeh, the whole lot of Ha'ivri Mizeh. But apart from the political phraseology and assessment into the future, there is this crucial question of the present. In whose favor has time worked till today? I would submit the thesis, which can be argued back and forth, that so far it has worked in our favor. The assessments we heard, and I take January 1968 as a point of issue, were of the possibilities of Soviet intervention in the Middle East, of Arab societies collapsing to communism, King Hussein of Jordan being swept away by Arab terrorists and Egyptian agents, of the Fatah turning Israel into a second Algeria, of maybe an economic collapse in Israel, of Nasser's armies as they developed, forcing the issue on the canal and elsewhere. So far, none of these assessments have been vindicated by them. This is not to say that they are completely out of shot in terms of realism. And so far, Baruch Hashem, none of them have taken place. On the other hand, in the course of this year and a half, the world has learned to acknowledge Israel's capacity for standing. It is no mere chance to the Soviet Union, which till May 1968 threatened Israel day in, day out. From that time began to cooperate with Yarin and at least to seek some form of moderation in its external posture. But who can know its inner mind? It is no mere chance that the Soviet Union has attempted to fall in line with some international consensus, which, though extremely hostile to us, at least is remote in very considerable degree from the animosity and threats which characterized their policies until May of last year. Why is this? It is because the Soviet Union realized that Israel will fight and without peace we will not yield. And Moscow is pressed by Nasser, who says, how long can I be in this dilemma? How long can I face my officer corps with the whole of Sinai in their hands and the canal sealed up? How long can I withstand their pressures for what may indeed be suicidal action? But I am faced with the dilemma of suicide, either inaction or in inaction. And Moscow's reply is, we will try to force Israel diplomatically to yield. In the meantime, under no account dare you get involved in a venture, the outcome of which nobody can know. I would say this is the first of our capacity to stand, of time as it is work. Secondly, if we take the issue of Jerusalem, the fact is that today the concept of redividing the city is obsolete in the minds of the world, even, I would believe, that of the Soviet Union. And again, across this hotel, the barbed wire goes up, and the city is cut in half. A second Berlin, that has receded from international consciousness. This does not mean the world has accepted our claim, our position, our sovereignty in unified Jerusalem. But it does mean a certain movement from what was accepted for over 20 years to what the situation is today. And movements in history, particularly when the city of eternity is involved, we cannot expect them to be too rapid. But thirdly, on the issue of time, here we come to the crucial dialogue, deeper than all others, and that is the intuitive meeting, now expressed for 20 years, totally intuitive, of Jew and Arab. What have this year and a half done in this field? Have they created any hope of this miasma of hatred at some time disappearing? Has this iron curtain really been raised? Or are we just living in a mirage in the desert? Are we realists in talking of peace? Or is this purely a political formula for argumentation alone without any realistic hope of implementation? This is very difficult to judge, because the Arab mind, with all its Oriental imagery and expression, remains ultimately a closed mind. And here lies the paradox, for even deeper, one does not know the Arabs themselves know their policy and their place in the world scene in our time. But we face a vast world of 40 million Arabs in this part of the East alone. And the question arises over the past year and a half, is there any movement? Or is everything as it was? And do we face this specter 2, 3, 5, 10 years hence, this vast world, as it coheses its unity, as it develops its dynamism, its ethos, its culture, its armies, its purpose, pressing down upon what they consider or have considered for the past 20 and 40 years to be an alien body striking in the very essence of the heart of the Arab homeland. And what I say now is my assessment. Many of my colleagues might accept it. I believe that although the danger of war has not receded, although the Arab armies are preparing for further war, I believe that as they come closer to war, they also simultaneously come deeper to this agonizing reappraisal as to whether indeed war will solve their problems, whether indeed their course over 20 years has been prudent, or whether they are marching to another catastrophe. I would say for the first time in the Arab mind, the possibilities are tilted on some balance. For before June 67, everything was so simple. As Nasser himself, only 2 months before the war, told a foreign observer, I do not need to fight them to destroy them. Time will vitiate them, will destroy their sinews, will snap their unity. This people cannot remain alone, an oasis in a vast world, hostile world surrounding them. As we get stronger, the very force of our dynamism, without action, will push them out of the area. How long, Nasser asked, can world Jewry feel as one people
with this tiny grouping in the Middle East. Surely it is against every logic this must snap. And he spoke of the Arab minority with its vast birth rates. And he spoke of the internal stresses of Ashkenazim and Sfardim. And he spoke of the economic future of world Jewry sustaining what he calls artificial states. And he said, every logic indicates it will perish of itself. And the words he used were, those Jews who will remain there will be like the Maronites in Lebanon or the Copts in Egypt. Does he really think so today? With all his blustering and his threats? True, he's dedicated to Arab fatalism, for after all, his patriotism grew from that and depends upon that. But we have the feeling that the Arab world, or some of its leaders, realized that somewhere they misconstrued the spiritual adventure which is Israel over 20 years. They do not believe today with that firmness, and I speak here not from speculation alone, with that firmness which characterized their dogma, their axiom for 20 years, that here is about the flotsam and jetsam of refugee problem, the chance survivors of Nazi death camps, linked together with oppressed Jews from the eastern communities across the Middle East. They're beginning to grasp that there's something deeper here. It becomes for them truly the world of the unknown, from which they shrink in fear. But their dogma, their axiom, their analysis, something has gone wrong. And they too, for the first time, march side by side with us into the unknown. No longer is the dilemma one-sided. No longer do we sit and ask, how do we survive 10, 20, 30 years hence? For the first time in the highest Arab Council do they sit with each other. For the first time they talk some element of truth, discarding from it that oriental imagery with which they enshroud their worlds presented to the Arab masses. And they talk for the first time of Arab survival. And they say, if we cannot get back the Western Bank, what happens to the Kingdom of Jordan? If we cannot open the canal and retrieve the peninsula, Sinai Peninsula, what becomes of Egypt? What will become of our regimes? Where do we move? And so the dilemma is at least mutual and common at this stage. Here lies the crucial point. And as they are in the same dilemma as we, they talk to us. They talk to us in many places. And they talk across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, day in, day out. And at some point the monster image of Israel has changed, not in terms of their political acceptance, but at least in terms of human psychology. And so there is a movement of thought. This may not produce any immediate result. Many years, maybe decades, may pass before a formal peace is signed, although there is a possibility to come earlier. But for the first time in their minds, Israel is part of the Middle East, and their dilemma is acute as ours, and they search in the Middle East and throughout the world how to overcome the dilemma. Here maybe lies the key, but precisely because of that, the pressures will grow. Those Arabs who claim that only war is the course, their voice gets stronger as the Arab armies reach higher military level. Their pressure on the world powers increases. Their blackmail, the sense of panic they introduce of war breaking out every day, this constant firing on the frontiers to keep it alive as a world issue of momentous proportions, the joint vast parade of propaganda of Moscow, Paris, and the Arab capitals, all moves to a pitch, and the pitch being to force us to yield before the crisis overtakes the Arab mind. This is essentially the race of time in the Middle East. And as I said, it is essentially a vast test of Jewish faith and Arab fatalism. Can we face up to it? This is the basic issue. We can yield today for temporary advantage. I'm sure that any agreement reached may keep us 5, 10, even 20 years tranquil. But a moment will come in history when we'll be asked, why did you yield? Was it because you didn't have enough money? Was it because you got the Phantom planes and couldn't pay for them? Was it because you couldn't maintain your reserve army of 10, 20, 30,000 soldiers, more day in, day out, all the time increasing, keeping the frontiers? Was it because you couldn't take the nervous tension of always being under pressure day in, day out, not knowing what the morrow brings? Or was it because the Jewish people throughout the world, they fought at standing with you if necessary in isolation? All these questions will be asked by the historian if God forbid we yield. But we have no intention of yielding. Come what may, no matter the sacrifice, no matter the financial cost, we will not cast away Jewish history just like that. We will stand where we are and insist upon peace. And let us see the other flow of thought and text as it moves across the capitals of the Middle East and throughout the world. But for this you need iron nerves. You need endless faith. You need Jewish unity of the highest order. You need the Jew to feel that this is a new epoch of Jewish history. If we are sure of it, that this is not temporary phase, but we've entered the broad uplands of a new world for the Jewish people, this sense of continuity flowing from this city, Yir Shechubra Yachdav, Shosar Kol Yisrael Chavirim, this sense will impart itself across the Middle East and across the world. But if we yield because of diplomatic formulations, because of a sense of weakness, because of the unknown, we may cast away an opportunity which will never return. This is the issue we face. And let us not minimize the difficulties. It's not so simple to face Soviet threats. It's not so simple to be sniped at across the canal day in, day out. It's not so simple to be in a city with tens of thousands of Arabs with the danger of explosion at every moment. It's not so easy for the settlements to sit in the Bayasan Valley and rush to the shelters night after night. All this might be easy if you could answer them when will be the end of it. But we must have faith and believe the end will bring with us triumph and victory. But if in Israel you grasp this sense of the unknown, you grasp this capacity to march in faith and unity across the United States, tell them these are not campaigns like every year. Again, an emergency campaign, 1, 2, 3. It's not a case of giving money. It's a case of total identification. And this alone, in total unity, will give us the strength to move in Yitzhak Hashem to the realization of this great and unprecedented epoch in which we live.
Grandmother. although they told me that in small places there are very few Jews, there is intermarriages between, of course, only with white people, either with British or with the Americans, but this is an exception. But all the Jews consider themselves as Jews. That's why I was also in South America, the first time in my life. In Brazil, in Argentina, and in Uruguay. In Brazil, there are black, but the black is similar to the white. There are Indians. I know that maybe there also still Indians, but I've never seen, I lived 3 years in America, I've never seen an Indian. But they are the real Americans. But I know what happened. But in Argentina, there's not a one black man, and there's no Indian, no white man. Because those, the Spanish people who came first to South Africa, they killed all the people there. They didn't leave a single Indian and a single non-white person. But the Americans had done, not in fact 100%. The Americans didn't do all of them. The majority they killed. So, in the head of the bunch, they brought black people from that, they brought black people from that. They brought them, they brought not black people from there. They brought them now, they have a third painful stuff. But it's not my business. But then, I've seen the children, not only the those who are not children. As you know, there was a Baron Hirsch in the end of the 19th century who had the idea Jews must have their own state. But this came to in Palestine, because then Palestine was the capital of Turkey. The moon made all its money in Turkey. He was afraid if he will buy land there, then he would take it away. He decided to do it in Argentina. And really he bought land in Argentina much more than the whole Palestine. And many Jews